Maria Fernanda Quesada, a girl born in 1994, lived in the city of Lagar Taneuva, Costa Rica. She was a pleasant and attractive person who dreamed of success and a happy life. Maria was distinguished by her strong and independent nature, and most of all, she aspired to become a caring mother. Career achievements did not interest her too much. Instead, she was more drawn to family comfort and the warmth of a home hearth. Given this, Maria always wanted to have brothers and sisters, but she was the only child of her parents. Her family served as an example of strong family ties for those around them. Her parents were able to provide their daughter with a comfortable life and an adequate level of education, which in the realities of modern Costa Rica, as in many Latin American countries, is more the exception than the rule. The girl had wonderful relationships with all family members. She had an especially close bond with her aunt on her mother's side, as they were also brought together by a small age gap. They shared all their experiences with each other, supported each other, and often met and communicated. Maria entrusted her aunt with her most intimate secrets. They were like best friends when they began to discuss the vicissitudes of their own lives. Maria was known for her sociability and bright disposition, easily finding common ground even with strangers. This trait helped her move towards the realization of her dreams, and also gained her many friends with whom she maintained relationships until the last days of her all-too-short life. Maria Fernanda experienced her first love at the age of 19. She was convinced that these were real feelings that would bring her happiness, family, children and a house by the sea. However, reality turned out to be much more prosaic. Her boyfriend simply used the girl and left her, becoming infatuated with another. As it turned out, she was pregnant at the time. 9 months later, a boy was born. Maria hoped that her ex would not remain indifferent to his son, but she was mistaken. When she tracked down the baby's biological father, he showed no interest in either her or the child. Under such circumstances, the girl had to work hard, because the family's financial situation was difficult. She sought to give her son a future no worse than what her parents had provided for her. Of course, they did not leave their daughter with a baby to fend for themselves. They continued to support her, which allowed them to create appropriate conditions for the child. During this period, all family members rallied even more closely around Maria to support her during this difficult time. It was not easy, but everyone made efforts. Fortunately, all this was happening in an era of advanced technologies, so the girl had access to a computer and the internet. She was not going to sit idly by, simply waiting for everything to work out on its own. Looking for an additional source of income, she mastered the technique of making handmade soap. Having tried this type of activity, she realized that she was capable of much more. Thus began Maria's path as a true specialist with a wide profile. In addition to selling handmade soap among acquaintances and other people via the internet, she mastered the art of manicure. The girl created several groups in various social networks to promote her services. Quite quickly, the circle of her clients began to expand. Maria dreamed of her own website and eventually opening a salon. The beauty industry attracted her, and almost immediately it brought good feedback. Clients were satisfied with the quality of services. At that time, the well-being of the child and the family were the primary issues for her. She devoted all her free time to her loved ones. Despite this, Maria did not abandon her dreams of love and family, striving to meet a man who would become her other half. And so, it seemed that fortune smiled upon her. During a regular trip to the city for materials, the girl met Esteban Ravira Vargas. The man was 12 years older than her. But despite this, the heroine of the story fell head over heels in love. How a stranger managed to make such an unforgettable impression on her remained a mystery. In fact, he was her complete opposite. Esteban was a hot-tempered and aggressive man with a rather controversial past. He clearly had ties to crime, but avoided this topic, not elaborating on exactly how. The lovers' relationship lasted several months before Maria decided to introduce Esteban to her family. This meeting was extremely tense. He left an unforgettable impression. So much so that her parents were categorically opposed to continuing this romance and persuaded their daughter to break up with her new man. However, the girl believed that she had the right to choose for herself who to date and under what conditions. The main reason for the troubles with her relatives was Esteban's rudeness, his constant use of profanity, and his complete disregard for others. He gave the impression of being a cruel and unpredictable person. He reacted so violently to Maria's parents' displeasure that the girl barely managed to calm him down and prevent a scandal. In the end, her parents insisted on a complete break of the relationship, but all this turned out to be in vain. Maria had strong feelings for him, so she was ready to continue the relationship with Esteban at any cost. Realizing the situation, her mother and father resigned themselves, as they did not want to spoil the relationship with their daughter and lose their grandson. A few days later, Maria met her husband's relatives. His family turned out to be a good match for Esteban himself. They were stern, rude people who seemed unkind to Maria. She confessed to her aunt that her partner was the most adequate of the whole family. Their relationship developed, despite the harshness and rudeness of his character. Esteban behaved quite restrainedly in the girl's presence. It seemed that she was the restraining factor that allowed a temperamental person to remain calm. On April 6, 2019, the couple officially married. Unfortunately, immediately after the conclusion of this union, Esteban clearly demonstrated how right Maria's parents were. The man turned out to be extremely cruel. Almost from the first day, he began to beat his wife, with the beatings repeated daily. The heroine of the story endured beatings and constant reproaches, physical and moral pressure, in order to preserve the recently created family. Moreover, she was already pregnant with a second child, whose father was Esteban. She believed that she would be able to endure the critical period, and after the birth of the baby everything would work out. In any case, the girl did not want to raise another child without a father. Maria gave birth for the second time in 2020. She was on the verge, so shortly before the child's birth she moved in with her parents. The young mother could no longer endure it, she began to fear for her own health and the condition of the baby. It seemed that after these events her husband really rethought something. Immediately after giving birth, he came to his wife, eloquently apologizing for all the mistakes and pain he had caused in the past. He thanked her for the birth of his son, swore that he would never raise his hand against her again, and would not cause conflict. Maria believed that her calculation had worked, but her relatives were not so optimistic, especially her mother and aunt, who understood that all this behavior was typical of manipulators, and therefore everything would be repeated again. In the first months, Esteban really spent all his free time with his son and young wife. He behaved like a real family man, did not raise his hand against her, and avoided exerting moral pressure. Everything looked as if family life was getting better, the young parents began to share happy moments together. Esteban also began to spend more time with Maria's older son, who at that time had turned 7 years old. Although the mother noticed that he paid more attention and sincerely loved only his own child, all these positive changes made her very happy. The head of the family even changed jobs and found a well-paid position, becoming a Spanish language teacher at a private school. In this educational institution, mostly foreign children studied. The man managed to get a prestigious position, the family's financial situation improved significantly. Maria repeatedly told relatives and friends that she was sincerely happy. Even her aunt began to think that this was really the case. The young mother more than once communicated with her relatives, telling them that after the birth of his son, Esteban had become a completely different person. The man took control of his aggressive and cruel temper, so family life became like a fairy tale that the young woman had always dreamed of. During this period, numerous family photos appeared on the couple's social media pages. In them, both the mother and the father were depicted with their babies. All this looked like a healthy and strong family. More than a year passed in such imaginary peace and carelessness. As it turned out, all this time Esteban was holding back his anger. All this was compressed like a spring and sooner or later had to burst out. At one point, he lost control of himself and broke down. The man again yelled at his wife for a far-fetched reason, raised his hand against her, leaving bruises on her face. Maria turned to her relatives in tears and told them what had happened. The young woman, as before, did not want to go to the police, hoping that everything would pass and it would be possible to preserve the family for the sake of the child. However, the situation was escalating too quickly. Literally after a few incidents, Esteban began to put pressure and bully even more than before the birth of the baby. Relatives insisted that it was necessary to finally break off this relationship. The man again turned into the cruel person he had always been. He could not cope with his inner evil. Finally, in December 2021, Maria, tired of beatings, turned to the police and accused her husband of domestic violence, which, according to her, had lasted for 2 years of their relationship. The young woman, together with her sons, moved in with her relatives. Although it was an investigation, the police managed to confirm the facts of repeated attacks, which were indicated not only by Maria's relatives, but also by numerous neighbors who witnessed the couple's quarrels. In addition, when she came to the police station to file a report, fresh beatings were recorded. Esteban had beaten his wife again, so badly that she had large bruises on her face. She insisted that this could not go on. The young mother feared for her life and health, as well as for her sons. Eventually, Maria managed to get a restraining order. At that time, Esteban had no right to approach her, as well as their common son, without Maria's permission. The heroine of the story warned her entire family that her husband should not appear even near the house. If they noticed him, they could boldly call the police. Neighbors confirmed that the young woman had endured constant bullying from her husband for many years. Almost every day he provoked scandals and brought them to brutal beatings. The heroine of the story was so intimidated that she was afraid to say a word to Esteban, so that all this would not lead to a fight. Maria was constantly seen with bruises, each time the reason for their appearance was the same. Even after receiving a restraining order, Esteban was regularly seen in the vicinity of the Quesada family home. It seemed that he was hanging around aimlessly, but it was obvious that in fact the man was looking for a meeting with his wife, whom he had lost. Every time an unwanted guest was seen, he would just walk away because he didn't want to provoke a police call. But he appeared in the area again and again, which looked extremely alarming. The couple was facing a divorce process, custody and property division. Unfortunately, all this was not happening fast enough. Maria hoped that she would be able to prove her husband's cruelty in order to completely deprive him of the opportunity to see his son. She was convinced that otherwise, as the boy grew older, like herself, he would become a victim of his father's cruelty. It seemed that Esteban simply could not control himself. On March 3, 2022, despite not asking for his wife's consent, he came to her parents' house. During this period, some of her relatives were there, who met Esteban at the doorstep with displeasure. He asked to speak with Maria to resolve certain issues related to the divorce process. The man insisted that it concerned the division of property that they had acquired. Witnesses to this meeting believed that despite his outward calmness, Esteban could barely restrain himself. However, he had never been seen calm since the very beginning of the disagreements with his wife. Maria agreed to talk to her husband, especially since he was not yelling or even swearing, as he usually did. Her relatives, on the other hand, did not want to let her go with this dangerous man, but Esteban insisted that Maria needed to go with him to pick up some personal belongings that had been left behind in a hurry when moving. The man claimed that the conversation on these issues should not be heard by an outsider. Finally, he managed to convince his wife to get into the car. He asked Maria to leave the older 9-year-old child with relatives, since it did not concern him either. Nevertheless, he wanted his wife to take their common son with her. The heroine of the story agreed. As soon as they drove away from her parents' house, they began to argue again, literally from the first minutes, as they managed to be alone in the car. Esteban became more and more aggressive and, in the end, again lost control of himself and began to shout. The car stopped on the side of the road, not far from the Quesada family home. One of the neighbors saw the couple arguing inside. In this state they reached the house where they lived before breaking up. Here the neighbors heard a crash and noise. It seemed as if Esteban was breaking things or beating his wife again. A child's cry came from the house. At that time their common son was only 2 years old. A child's voice begged him to stop. Later, one of the neighbors on the street heard the woman asking for help. The man immediately ran to the house. Because he did not take his cell phone with him, he wanted to call the police. At the same time, Esteban called his sister. The man confessed that he had just stabbed his ex-wife in front of his son. He insisted that she attacked him. The sister was in shock. She begged her inadequate brother to take the child with him and go to the police, but he did not listen. Instead, Esteban left the crime scene. He went out into the street in the same bloody shirt in which he had stabbed Maria a few minutes before. The man was with the child, put him in the car, buckled him into the front passenger seat. Esteban disappeared very quickly from the crime scene, despite the fact that several neighbors managed to call the police. In addition, his sister called law enforcement and told them what had happened, but the officers were late. When the patrol arrived at the scene, Esteban had long since left. The territory of the house was fenced off. Inside was the mutilated body of 28-year-old Maria. The man stabbed his wife in the kitchen, catching her by surprise. First of all, law enforcement officers questioned the neighbors, who by the time the police officers arrived had already gathered near the couple's house. They immediately confirmed that Esteban had a long history of violence. The man generally made an unpleasant impression. Most of the local residents did not like him, as Esteban seemed to be very rude, cruel, and could easily yell for no reason. He regularly had conflicts with others, so people preferred to just stay away from him. They knew about the situation in the family, advised Maria to leave him, but Maria did not listen. She herself refused to go to the police at the initial stages of the relationship. The wife even refused everyone who offered her this solution. Finally she left him, got a restraining order, and for some reason got into his car again, which became a fatal mistake. At the same time, a white van with the suspect and his 2-year-old son was speeding down the road. The boy was the only witness to the brutal massacre. Before his eyes, his own father inflicted 11 stab wounds on his mother, most of which fell on the upper body and head. The victim tried to resist, but she could not do anything. Judging by the location of several wounds, Esteban insidiously attacked from behind. It did not look like she provoked him. Her desperate attempts to hold back the onslaught were doomed in advance. Realizing that the man with his child was trying to escape, a large-scale operation was organized to detain him. The criminal's car was put on the wanted list. Several patrol crews were involved, who were going to intercept a particularly dangerous offender. His condition and intentions were unclear. It was obvious that he had taken his 2-year-old son in an inadequate state. The child could be in danger. The police could not use harsh methods to stop the criminal for fear of harming the boy. They had to accompany him until the moment the fuel ran out. Unfortunately, it was not possible to catch or even track him. Almost immediately after the start of the search, the police found Esteban's abandoned car, just a few kilometers from the house where the bloody massacre took place, which means that he had already changed to another vehicle. The forecasts were disappointing, as the police had no information about what car Esteban was traveling in. It also seemed that the man with the child had only one way to retreat, crossing the border. And this means that they could completely lose him. The suspect could go by bus and get lost in the crowd, or use another car, or catch a ride. The authorities had the opportunity to notify the checkpoints. There was a chance that when trying to cross the border, Esteban would be detained. This calculation turned out to be correct. Soon, after a few hours, the police managed to track down Esteban. He tried to pass through a checkpoint in a stolen car. Naturally, the border officials were notified, so as soon as he presented his documents, the chase was over, and he was detained. The man did not resist during the arrest. His 2-year-old son was in the passenger seat the whole time, fortunately unharmed. During searches of the car, a firearm was found. as well as a bloody knife that could have been the murder weapon used on Maria. Why he still hadn't gotten rid of it was unclear. The criminal had a long history of violence for which he had already been held accountable multiple times. Given that this was a dangerous repeat offender, he was immediately sent to the police in his hometown and placed in prison. Now Esteban had no chance of leniency. The man was accused of femicide, the murder of a woman, and he was facing a severe punishment, which is traditionally assigned under this article in Latin American countries. After examining the knife found in the car, it was possible to confirm that the blood belonged to the victim. Only the killer's fingerprints were found on the handle. There could be no doubt about his guilt. Detectives spoke with the couple's son. The 2-year-old boy spoke with difficulty. He was very frightened, but from his words it became clear that his father had attacked his mother and caused her pain. He was also afraid of knives. As it turned out, this phobia had developed in him long before his biological father's crime. Apparently, Esteban had repeatedly threatened his wife with reprisals with a cold weapon in his hands, so often that even a 2-year-old child developed a fear of kitchen knives. Maria's parents wanted custody of the children to be transferred to the grandmother and grandfather on the maternal side. The older child was immediately given to the parents of the murdered mother, but there were difficulties with the younger one. Despite the fact that Esteban had killed the boy's mother before his very eyes and was even in prison awaiting trial, he still had rights to the child under Costa Rican law. The boy found himself embroiled in a complex legal conflict over the division of custody between the families of the biological parents. The Ravira family decided to fight for custody of the boy, using the dirtiest methods to do so. They tried to smear Maria to make her appear as a worthless mother. It was assumed that this could be used to justify the murder. They also tried to ruin the reputation of the murdered woman's parents, portraying them in an unflattering light as inappropriate guardians. Esteban's relatives, together with himself and a lawyer, wove a dense web of lies, trying to portray their son, a domestic tyrant, as a real hero. From their words, it appeared that Maria had not paid proper attention to her sons for a long time. That is why the husband so often lashed out at his wife. In the end, it was the behavior of the young mother and her attitude towards the children, in their opinion, that forced Esteban to take up a knife in a fit of anger. The man's relatives distorted the real events so much that Esteban was portrayed as a victim of the situation. It looked simply absurd. Maria's relatives had heard for many years how she was suffering from moral and physical pressure, constant beatings and threats. This was confirmed by members of her family, friends, and neighbors of the couple. At the same time, Esteban's mother, father and even sister insisted that in fact this wife intimidated and threatened her husband. From their words, it appeared that she was not going to provide the child with proper care. Instead, she pressured her husband and threatened him herself if he did not obey. According to the criminal's family, during another conflict provoked by the wife on the basis of the divorce process, Maria attacked him. Esteban was forced to defend himself and grabbed the first thing that came to hand, namely a kitchen knife. He managed to stop his enraged wife with only 11 stab wounds. Of course, this was an obvious lie. Nevertheless, the statements of Esteban's relatives significantly complicated and slowed down the progress of the investigation. The prosecution needed to refute all these testimonies and find evidence of the correctness of the Quesada family. For this, it was decided to exhume Maria's body, which by this time had already been buried. The forensic expert had to conduct a second examination to verify and clarify the circumstances of the heroine's death. For this, the court postponed the hearing. This situation provoked the activity of many feminist groups who were closely following this horrific case of violence. In March 2023, large-scale protests took place, which demonstrated great support for the victim's family. Obviously, Esteban and his relatives' false story did not impress anyone. It seemed that only the defense believed in it. Everyone was concerned about only one issue, the court's decision. People did not want the killer to escape punishment, or even receive a more lenient sentence than the maximum possible. Women across the country stated that impunity only provokes an even greater number of such bloody crimes, and statistics from Costa Rica confirmed these words. The trial of 41-year-old Esteban Ravira Vargas, a domestic tyrant, continued in Santa Cruz on March 9, 2023. The prosecution insisted that he had deliberately taken the life of his 28-year-old wife. The lawyer, together with the defendant and his family, insisted on the fictional story that the defendant was the victim. Of course, all their arguments were quickly refuted. On the side of the prosecution were numerous witnesses to the man's cruelty, including several neighbors. The Quesada family also insisted that Maria had complained about her husband's behavior for many years. From the very beginning, they were convinced that he was an inadequate and cruel person. Unfortunately, youth and naivety did not allow the young mother to make the right choice. The lies of the Ravira family were refuted with the help of a forensic medical examination, which put a bold point in this case. Given the nature of the injuries sustained, there could be no question of an attack by Maria. 2 blows to the back indicated a deliberate attack. From the very beginning Esteban sought blood. The couple's younger son was not used as a witness due to his age. However, the court demonstrated recordings of communication with the 2-year-old child. From this conversation, it became obvious that the father constantly behaved aggressively and often hurt his mother. The older son testified in court and confirmed his brother's words about the violence by Esteban. Both children were afraid of him, especially the older one, for whom the defendant was not the biological father and was biased towards him. Both sons were sent for treatment. They were to receive psychological help due to the loss of their mother. The prosecution requested 37 years in prison for the defendant. The defense insisted on the man's innocence until the end. They tried to reduce the sentence and even more, they wanted to achieve his complete acquittal. Fortunately, all this turned out to be in vain. In May 2023, the court ruled in favor of Maria. The criminal was sentenced to 35 years and 8 months in prison. He is still serving his sentence in a strict regime correctional facility. In addition, Esteban must compensate for the damage to the family of the deceased, which provides for a payment of 75 million Costa Rican colons, which is approximately $150,000, as well as another $25,000 to cover the costs of psychological assistance for the children. It is unlikely that this money will be paid. That's all for now. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future content. Take care and goodbye.